Latropeth Language Tutorial 14, we're going to talk about relative clauses. Let's begin by asking, what is a clause? A clause is a combination of words within a sentence that is comprised of a subject and a predicate. So a subject is like a topic, and the predicate is something that says something about the topic subject. So it predicates something about it. So some clause examples from English. The car is red, she is skiing, big cities are crowded. So for example, the car is red, the car will be the subject, and is red is the predicate. Predicates in English and in European languages generally do contain a verb, like is, but it's not the case across languages universally. Now you might be saying, well, isn't a clause just the same thing as a sentence? Not exactly. So to exemplify that, so firstly up here we have one clause, one sentence example. The car is red. That's one clause. That's also one sentence. Below that we have an example of a sentence that contains two clauses, so they're not synonymous. The man left after the food arrived. So we have two clauses in here, the man left and the food arrived. They are joined together into one sentence with a subordinating conjunction that says something about the relationship between the two clauses, in this case to do with a time relationship. Which brings us to what is a relative clause. Okay, so a relative clause is one kind of dependent clause. It has a subject and a verb but cannot stand alone as a sentence. It's sometimes called an adjective clause because it functions like an adjective. It gives more information about a noun. So I was searching for definitions of relative clause for this. There's my source below. And I wanted one like this that talked about it being like an adjective, because essentially that's a good way of explaining it. A good way of introducing the concept of a relative clause is that it really behaves like an adjective, because it's says something about the noun, but it's basically a clause instead of one word like happy, merry. Relative clause examples. So I've got three sentences here. The relative clause appears down the bottom. So let's begin at the top with the simple clause, the car is moving. Below that I have a simple clause with an adjective, the blue car is moving. The adjective blue is qualifying the noun car. Below that I have a sentence with a relative clause embedded. The car, which is blue, is moving. Which is blue, the bit in red, is the relative clause. The main proposition or clause is the car is moving. The relative clause is embedded within it. And it's really giving you information about the car, so you can see that it's operating like an adjective. Restrictive versus non-restrictive relative clauses. So I'll touch upon this because whenever relative clauses are introduced, they'll normally point out the distinction between these two types. A sentence with a restrictive relative clause, that is the man that I saw yesterday. So a restrictive relative clause will narrow down the reference of a noun. So I might say that is the man, and you might say what man, and I might say that is the man that I saw yesterday. So the relative clause in this case is narrowing down the reference to specify which man, which man. Below that is a sentence with a non-restrictive relative clause. And it's like a sort of incidental additional piece of information about the noun. The man who is the bus driver, incidentally, the man who is a bus driver ran through the street. In English, relative clauses are introduced by relative pronouns such as who, whom, that, which. So the man that I saw, the man who eats the apple, the man whom I saw, the course which I took. There's a bunch of them in English, and they appear at the beginning of the relative clause, and they make reference back to the noun in the main clause that has been qualified by the relative clause. Different languages have different strategies to actually achieve the function of a relative clause. So there's different ways of doing it. Some languages would treat it like it's a big adjective, which essentially it is. The I saw yesterday man type of thing. English and some other languages use this relative pronoun, what's known as a relative pronoun gap strategy. Now let's move on to relative clauses in Latropeth. Latropeth uses a relative pronoun strategy for relative clauses as well as English. However, in Latropeth, the relative pronoun appears within the relative clause in the place of and in the same position where a noun would normally appear in a clause. So this will make a bit more sense when we move on to a later slide. Let's first look at the relative pronouns in Latropeth. There are actually 10 of them. The reason why there's 10 of them is because they are based on the 10 noun classes of Latropeth. In the relative clauses, the relative pronouns will refer back to a noun in a main clause, and they will cross-reference the noun by way of noun class. The relative pronoun will cross-reference the noun in the main clause, and it'll cross-reference it by noun class. These are the 10 relative pronouns of Latropeth. So for noun class 1, we have dasawu, noun class 2, chiesawu, and then we have pisawu, lasawu, nasawu, yasawu, fasawu, asawu, nisawu, fosawu. If you want a refresher on noun classes, then have a look at the language tutorial number 2. Okay, now let's have a look at a relative clause in English, and then below that the same equivalent relative clause being used in Latropeth. So let's begin with the English. The man that I saw yesterday goes to the river. Okay, now the main proposition, the main clause is the man goes to the river. Qualifying the man, the noun man, you have a relative clause here, so it's operating a bit like an adjective, and the relative clause is in red, that I saw yesterday, and it's introduced with a relative pronoun, which is that. The man that I saw yesterday goes to the river. The relative pronoun is making a reference back to the noun man in the main clause. Below that, we have the equivalent in Latropeth. It's probably best to think of it in Latropeth initially as just 2 sentences put together. So let's look at the first one above in black. The next slide will actually break down the grammar of the sentence. Remember, in Latropeth, it's a verb initial language, so it begins with the verb. Essentially, it would translate as the man goes to the river. Basically, goes the man to the river. Okay. Below that, you have in red a relative clause, which is going to qualify nakum, the man. Oh my goodness, I spelt it incorrectly. Let me correct that on the spot if I can. No? Okay. Yeah, this should be nakum, not nakam. Okay. So anyway, below that, amupiyikiyis kunim kaya pisawu. Amupiyikiyis. So this is basically to see. Kunim is yesterday, that's the adverb. And then you have the man kaya pisawu. Kaya, if you can remember, basically normally precedes any animate object. So in this relative clause, the man is the recipient of the action of the seeing, so he's an object. So therefore, he's preceded by kaya. And instead of saying kaya nakum, I've said kaya pisawu. So I've substituted man with a relative pronoun, pisawu. So let's just look at the whole thing together. Again, apologies, this should be nakum. Pita neo yis nakum neo punim nasu, amupiyika yis kunim kaya pisawu. The man goes to the river. I saw yesterday. Okay? And if you think of the relationship they have with each other, in translating it into natural English, the man that I saw yesterday goes to the river. So let's break down the grammar again of the sentence in Latropeth containing a relative clause. It's the same sentence, but we've broken down the elements of the grammar. So piteniois is the verb, which is talking about going, neo. Nakum, the man, neo punim nasu, to the river. Literally to the front of or to the face of the river. So this is just the way that you generally express it in Latropeth. But below that, I have a relative clause that is adding some information about the man, nakum, which I've spelt correctly in this slide. The reason you know it's a relative clause is it contains this relative pronoun pisawu. And you know from the form of the relative pronoun, it's noun class 1, that it's referring back to the noun in the main clause, nakum, which is noun class 1. And if we have a look at the relative clause, amu piyikiyis, this is talking about I see him, essentially. Kunim, yesterday, your adverb, and kaya pisawu, and this is tying it together with a relative pronoun preceded with animate object marker kaya. So when you marry the two together, you get something that will translate as the man goes to the river that I saw yesterday, or the man that I saw yesterday goes to the river. Pitinio yis nakumnu yapunim nasu amu piyika yis kunim kaya pisawu. Thanks for watching.